Okay, welcome to the next session. For the first talk of the session, we have David with a talk on communication. So please welcome David.
Hi, yeah, so my weird trick is on the morning of your talk, make sure you know where your laptop power supply is, otherwise you'll end up running back and forwards across Cardiff in a blind panic. Thanks for listening. I'm Dave. I'm an R&D engineer at Transversal Variant, based in Cambridge and working on search knowledge management type stuff. My pronouns are he and him. My Twitter is around within Dave, but basically don't follow that for tech stuff. It's mostly about what beer I've been drinking or whatever. I mentioned this in the last talk I gave, like on UK, someone followed me anyway, and they came up to me a couple of months later and said, wow, you really weren't kidding about your Twitter feed. I am a technical person. I've been a Python developer for about 10 years. Before that, I did a pure maths PhD. I enjoy solving difficult technical problems. I'm one of these people. I'm happy if I'm kind of sat at a desk, quiet desk in the corner with headphones on and a text editor open and some really interesting, difficult problems to solve with code. I'm not a natural communicator. I hope for your sake as well as mine that I'm not too bad at it, but it's something that I have to work at and think about rather than just something I kind of just naturally find that I do and find easy. But communication is important. I mean, this is sort of obvious in the modern world. No matter how good we are at solving technical problems, if you can't communicate, you can't find out what the problems are that you need to be solving, what's the really valuable and impactful things that you can do. You can't work with other people to solve those things. You can kind of collaborate with and help. And you also can't let people know that you've solved their problems. So however well you've solved them, people might not be able to find out that you've solved their problems for them. And if you communicate badly enough, then people won't want to work with you, and they won't use anything that you do actually write. I'm quite fortunate that when I sort of started off my journey through the world of tech, I worked for a company that made a quite good effort they would hire very technical problem solvers and would do everything they can to make sure that as many of them as possible become at least kind of basically competent at communicating well enough to do sort of everyday business stuff. And the way that they taught this was basically through a sort of series of internal courses and stuff, but the first thing they told you is some advice that has stuck with me and I found quite helpful over the years, and which I'm basically going to sort of base this talk around. And that advice is that when you try to communicate with people, first of all, before you start, think about what you want to do as a result. The important thing here is what you want them to do. It's not what you want to tell them, it's how you want to change their behaviour, their life, their thinking. This sounds quite obvious, but at the same time, when I get into a situation where I'm trying to communicate, I'm having a conversation that's going nowhere, or I'm sort of writing some documentation and it's not really making sense and taking forever to write, I often realise that this is what I've forgotten to do and this is the thing that's going wrong. So basically what I'm going to do for this talk is I'm going to dig into what exactly I mean by this, and then I'm basically going to give some examples. The bulk of the talk is going to be a few examples of different situations where thinking about what the outcome of a piece of communication is helps you to do that piece of communication better. So first of all, what sort of communication are we talking about? We're talking about person-to-person conversations. So conversations, emails, anything of that sort. We're also talking about meetings. At this point I can steal David McKeever's quote from yesterday about meetings just conversations but worse. It's also bigger things like talks and lectures. So it could be an internal talk, it could be a talk to a technical conference, it could be a talk to a kind of a user group or something, a group of your users of your software. And also documentation. So we're talking about communication with a greater goal. I mean, this isn't about kind of, if you're going for coffee with your friends, you just want to have a nice time and talk to people. I'm not saying you need to kind of meticulously plan that out. Maybe if you're going out for a coffee with your friends to plan a climbing trip to the Alps that you've got coming up next month, then actually you might want to think about it that way though. Secondly, I guess, what do you mean by wanting people to do something? I mean, it sounds easy to say you want people to do something, but that covers a multitude of sins. So first of all, there's concrete stuff. I might want someone to tell me something. I might want someone to write some code that does something that I need. I might want someone to use the library that I've written. But as well as concrete stuff, like I don't want this to sound like it's very kind of motivated by concrete stuff. Less tangible things are really important as well. You might want people to feel like they're part of a team, like they're working with you. People on your team are working with you rather than against you. You might want people to be inspired. You know, you don't necessarily have some concrete thing that you want to go out and do tomorrow, but whatever you want to do, you want to go out and do it with a bit more sort of zing. It's perhaps sometimes worth being careful with this, because I think most people have probably at some point been in a sort of work-related thing where the idea has been to make you feel inspired and part of the team, and what you've actually felt is mostly bored. So it's possible to kind of go overboard on it, but at the same time, this is important. It's not restricted to just concrete stuff. So, examples. I'm basically going to talk through a series of examples of communication that you might get involved with as someone who's involved with tech, and talk about how thinking about the outcomes that you want can help you to do them better and avoid sort of pitfalls. So the first one is person-to-person communication. This is probably the thing we do most commonly, I think. We email people at work, we talk to people who are working on the same open source project as us. They're often fairly quick bits of communication, but they're still very important. An example I'm going to use is a situation which I get into perhaps more often than I'd like. I need help with a problem. I'm stuck on something, I'm trying to do something at work, and nothing makes sense. I need to go and talk to someone who is more experienced, knows more about a particular thing than me, or is basically just cleverer than me, and get to help me. So, I need help is not an outcome, or it is an outcome, but it's not as concrete an outcome as I could go for. I've often found that I will go to someone going, stuck, and then have a kind of a very long, slightly frustrating conversation with them. It's more helpful more of the time if what I go to them is to say, I'm stuck on this, can you point me to the documentation for it? Or alternatively, maybe I'm stuck trying to use this, I think it's worth not doing what it's meant to do, can you fix it for me? Or sometimes, I'm stuck on this, can you explain to me what it's meant to do so that I can go away and fix it myself? And I've found myself that any of these conversations can often be a lot easier to have than just help, if you can get to a point where you know what your problem is. So, interpersonal conversations are normally fairly small bits of conversation, and I mean, to an extent, if you do them wrong consistently, then it's probably bad, but any individual one going wrong isn't a disaster. Documentation is a big deal. If you have bad documentation, then you end up with users who are at best unhappy users and at worst ex-users. Not in the ex-parrot sense, but in the no longer using your product sense. They've tried to use it and they didn't understand it because documentation is not good enough. So they've just given up and gone to use something else. This section of the talk is inspired by a talk by Daniele called What Nobody Tells You About Documentation, which is basically just a really good talk. So I'm going to pull out two things from it basically and talk about them, but go and watch the whole thing, it's great. It's on YouTube in various places, from various conferences. The key point that Daniele makes is that documentation is not one thing, but it's four separate things. There are essentially four kind of big classes of document that you might write that make up your documentation. Those classes are tutorials, how-to guides, reference material, and discussion. And getting these things mixed up is trying to write reference material into your tutorial or include a how-to guide in your discussion. Is a very good way of ending up with bad documentation, unhappy users, and also making it harder for you to write it. You spend more time trying to work out why your documentation isn't as good as you think it is, when you could just do the right thing and make it better more quickly. Yes, see the original talk for the full discussion. I'm just going to talk about the first two and how you can think about them in terms of the outcome you want. Because tutorials and how-to guides, they're very easy to confuse because both of them look quite similar. A tutorial is a series of steps telling someone how to do something. A how-to guide is also a series of steps telling them how to do something. But they differ in very important ways. And the most important way they differ is what you want the outcome to be. So for a tutorial, the word is tutorial, it's a teaching tool. I want to teach people something, and I want to build their confidence with my software. So what this means in terms of how I write it, I assume minimal knowledge. This is someone who's come to this particular topic from fresh. I can't, if it's a real beginner's tutorial, I can't just say open your favourite text editor or now create a directory here to keep something in and change the permissions to this. I really have to say run this command, run this command, run this command. It also means I choose what they're doing. I've decided that I want to teach people something because I think it's important for them to learn it. And I am deciding what that is. I'm not giving them options. I want them to build confidence. I want to get to the end of it and get a tangible result as easily as possible. So I don't want to sort of flummox them with, do you want to do it this way, or do you want to do it this way, and do you want to host it on here, or do you want to host it on here? You know, you can deploy it in multiple ways or whatever. I'll pick a thing which I think is the easiest thing to get the results I want, and get them to do it. And the other thing is that a tutorial is about teaching by doing. It's about learning by doing rather than learning by telling. So I want to avoid long explanations. I want to give them the minimal information to know what they're actually doing, without going off into a kind of a long philosophical discussion of why. Because probably by the time they get to the end of that, they'll have got confused, lost interest, had something else come up, or whatever, and they won't actually get the experience of doing a thing that I want them to get. So it's a similar sounding thing as a how-to guide, but the goal of a how-to guide is completely different. The outcome of a how-to guide is that someone who has a thing that they need to do can do it. This is for someone who's using the software, possibly in anger, and they possibly for someone who's sort of it might be someone who's a user just setting it up for the first time, but it might be an on-call person who's just got woken up at 2 in the morning and needs to get the servers back up and running and get everything back to life before customers start shouting at them. These people have slightly different needs from a how-to guide than the beginner has from a tutorial. Firstly, I can assume some knowledge probably. I don't need to tell my 24/7 support people how to open a text editor. They can probably do that. If I tell them to go and edit this file in this location, they'll do that. What they might need is options. Not everyone has exactly the same. A broad need that someone has to accomplish might not be the same for exactly everyone. I don't want to write a completely separate how-to guide for every scenario. So my how-to guide can include that sort of information. But how-to guides, again, do not contain any explanation. This is not about teaching people a thing. It's not about giving people some interesting perspective on a thing. It's about getting them to do the thing that they want to do. Cool, so the other sorts of documentation, again, just go and watch Daniele's talk to see them. So when I was thinking about this talk, I wasn't quite sure whether the basic premise was like trivially obvious and everyone does it anyway. And then I thought about meetings that I go to, and I thought, no, there are definitely probably some people out there in the world for whom this information would be useful. So for meetings, knowing what you want to achieve is absolutely crucial. Knowing what you want to achieve lets you decide who needs to be there. If you're going to make technical decisions, you need technical people there, but you may not need sort of product management people there unless the technical decisions impact on that. If you're going to make usability decisions, then you probably need someone there representing users. It also decides what's on the agenda. So obviously, if our goal is to sort of is to decide which way to implement something, then discuss how to implement this thing should be on the agenda. It also decides what's off the agenda. So if your goal is to get user requirements, then discussing how to implement the thing should not be on the agenda. So yeah, the examples of this are some project meetings that you might often have on a project. This is from sort of within the commercial world, from my experience. I think people in the open source world will have probably similar sorts of experiences, but possibly through different media or different ways of sort of different channels. So one thing I might want is users to tell me about their problems. Another thing I want is for the product management people to decide which of the problems that we've already got from the users, which of the things they've told us about, are really the highest priorities. Which ones are actually going to make us sell more products or whatever, or have happier users, and which ones are sort of people might talk about them a lot, but they don't really actually matter when it comes down to it. And also I might want to talk to engineers about how we're going to solve them. And again, most of these meetings will go wrong if you try to do the wrong thing in the wrong one. People often want to, but it needs to be focused on what you're trying to achieve. You'll definitely, if you get it wrong, waste people's time. If it goes really badly, you might end up not getting what you wanted done. Was the argument between the engineers in the requirements gathering meeting ends up taking so long that the users don't have time to tell you what they want. Cool, so the final area I was going to talk to you about talks, and it feels really big-headed to come to a conference where loads of really good people are speaking and talk about how to give better talks. First of all, I want to say that the standard of talks at PyCon UK is generally really high, and this isn't a sort of a broad criticism aimed at anything, but I do think that a technical talk is a really interesting example of how thinking about outcomes can make the difference between something really good and something which is sort of alright. And the example I'm going to work with here is the classic reason for giving a technical talk, which is I've written a library. I've got this open source project, it's great, I've written it, and I want to tell everyone about it. But actually, I hopefully don't want to tell people about it. What I want is for people to do something about it. And there are a few things I might want to do here. So, my example is, this comes from one of my areas of specific nerdery. Suppose I've written I've got some piece of 1980s music hardware, studio music hardware, and it's great, and I've written a library that allows me to configure it using Python. So, one talk I might give is, I want people to use my library. This is one sort of talk. So what I need to say here is that, first of all, the thing that my library does is actually a really useful thing to do. This piece of 1980s music hardware is really cool. It makes great noises, you can buy them really cheaply on eBay because no one's using them anymore. The one problem is, you need to have an Atari to configure it. That's difficult. But now it's not difficult, because I've solved that problem because I've written a Python library that talks to it. And yes, also I need to tell you, maybe it can deal with that thing that you were worried about, that special case. Oh, I've got the 1987 Model B, but you seem to be using the 1985 Model A. Will it work with that as well? Well, yes, it will actually. I can configure what model I want to use. I can even use the 1989 Model C. What I don't need to give you in this talk is too much about how I wrote it. Because if you want to use it, you aren't really interested in, you probably aren't very interested in, did I store the config files as XML or as JSON or as something else? So long as they're stored and they come out when you need them, you're able to use the library. And you can worry about that sort of detail later. The second thing is, I might want you to write your library a bit like mine. You might have some slightly different piece of old music hardware that also requires something slightly different to configure it, but it's still difficult. So again, I probably want to tell you why we care about this broad class of problem, that there's a whole world of obscure bits of 1980s music hardware out there that no one can use anymore, and they're all very available in sort of second-hand shops for absolutely nothing. But now I do want to tell you about how I wrote my library, because I might want to tell you about the obstacles I encountered and how I solved them. I found this really great resource that you can download the technical specs for all these old things on this website that some sort of random geek somewhere has put up. So it's great, you can find out. You might think this is going to be difficult, but actually it's solvable by doing this. And a third thing is actually, this is getting into the intangibles. I want you to write a library or something, or do something totally unlike mine, but I might want you to be inspired by my story. So I might say, hey, I came to this not as a Python programmer, but as a musician. And I started learning Python to do this, and I found it hard, but I managed to do it. And by finding help from the community and getting resources, I've written this really cool thing, and it does something useful, look. And hey, if I can do this, then surely all you people who are at least as good as I was when I started can go out and solve whatever problems you've got too. You know, just go and try something and see what happens. And this is again a different talk. It involves a lot more biographical detail. You know, if I'm telling you how to solve the problem, I don't necessarily tell you where I was when I needed to start solving it. But if I'm telling you that you can solve whatever problem, then that's kind of an interesting thing to hear. Cool, so I'm going to wrap up the section on talks with a quote from David McKeever on Twitter, which is that the amount of content that your audience will retain from a talk is basically 1. There's no units on this, it's just 1. So this is closely related to the one thing that you want people to do. If you want people to use your library, what you probably want to do is go and look at it and read the documentation, download it and try it. You don't necessarily want them to remember the entire API from your talk, because you've got documentation for that, hopefully. If you want to write something different, you might want to go out and look at another thing. Again, you don't necessarily need them to remember everything you told them. But it also applies to this talk. So I've talked about a few sorts of communication. We talked about interpersonal conversation, about meetings, about documentation, and about talks. But we could also talk about log messages. We could talk about code comments. There are all sorts of situations that we're often in where we're doing some piece of communication which is aided by knowing what we're trying to do with it. But basically all this is just kind of reinforcing this one central idea, which is when you try to communicate with people, first think about what you want to do as a result of that communication. I've found this quite helpful over the years, and I hope that some of you will too. Cool, thanks for listening.
Okay, so David is not taking questions right now, but he's happy to have a chat
Yeah.
about his talk and everything later on.
Yeah.
So later. Let's thank him again.